feel like it's pretty typical to feel overwhelmed whenever a new region is released because there's just so much new information to absorb. There's new factions to encounter, new politics to decipher, new non-human species to meet, new legends to uncover, and new phenomenon to discover, all accompanied by a whole new vocabulary list to memorize. And Nod Krai is no exception here. In fact, unless you're deep in the lore weeds like I am, you might find yourself being a little more overloaded than usual. And that's because Nod Krai has more than just its own history to share with us. Unlike other regions, Nod Krai is also acting as a sort of primer for Teyvat's most ancient history. So if you weren't familiar with the deep lore already, you might have felt like this was a bit of a rough ride. For that reason, I thought now would be a great time to compile everything we know about Teyvat's mysterious ancient history in chronological order, while also explaining some of the new important terminology and concepts like Kuuvahki, moon gates, moon marrow, and that kind of thing. Originally, I was also going to include the history of Nod Krai in this video, but I think we're gonna save that for another day. I feel like Teyvat's ancient history needs to be its own thing for right now. Now do note that while I won't be covering the events of Nod Krai's Archon quests, I will be pulling information from them for recap purposes, so do make sure you're up to speed on those lest you get spoiled accidentally. But before we get to all that, I gotta ask you a quick question. Do you like sci-fi fantasy-style RPGs with real-time strategic combat systems, coupled with automated resource farming that's optimized in the background by factory systems you designed? Well then, you're gonna love Arknights Endfield because it's all of those things as well as a sponsor of today's video. Arknights Endfield lets you explore the vast, mostly untouched world of Talos 2 through the eyes of Endfield Industries' infamous Endministrator. The pun is intentional. Your job as the Endministrator is to assist in furthering civilization's development on Talos 2. This means exploring both the known and unknown sectors of the planet in search of valuable resources for construction, crafting, and powering up your operators, so optimizing your resource harvesting system is a must. And that's where the Automated Industry Complex factory system comes into play. You can set up your machines to collect, process, and manufacture coveted materials in a completely automated and satisfying workflow thanks to this AIC system. It might look a little daunting at first, but don't worry because the blueprint system lets you design, share, and save production layouts, which certainly streamlines things and eases the learning curve a little bit. Now, of course, the exploration of a new planet always comes with risks, and Talos 2 is no exception. You'll be facing hordes of monsters and even human threats during your expedition, so you're gonna need to strategically deploy and command your team of 4 operators in combat. These fast-paced battles take place in real time, but you won't get far by just mashing buttons. You can't rely on the overwhelming strength of a single unit. You're gonna have to focus on teamwork, and that means exploiting status ailments, art inflictions, and using team-based combos. That's the only way you're gonna win these combat encounters and keep the story moving forward. And this game has a beautifully rendered story full of expressive characters, stunning locations, and of course, a whole lot of lore. And y'all know how much I love me some good lore. I mean, you are watching a lore video right now. So trust me when I say that Arknights Endfield promises to be a real treat when it releases in early 2026 on PlayStation 5, PC, iOS, and Android. So now's the perfect time to pre-register using my link in the description. So y'all should get to clicking and I'll see you on launch day. A big thanks to Arknights Endfield for sponsoring this video and for also making a game I'm personally looking forward to. But now is the time for us to rise and bring forth our Kuuvankis too! Learn more about the lore of ancient Teyvat. So let's get into that. Everything you might need, including citations and timestamps and spoiler warnings, are in the description box. Make sure you check that. Any corrections there may be will be in a pinned comment. And without further ado, we're going to kick off this chronological recap by starting at the very beginning of time in Teyvat. Once upon a time, a dragon was born alongside a tiny little world. That dragon was named Nibelung, and he loved his little planet and the creatures on it more than anything. But one day, Nibelung met an ancient space traveler by the name of Voyager who became his friend. Now, Voyager had left her body behind in an undisclosed location so her spirit could travel the dying universe and chronicle the rise and fall of all of the countless civilizations within it. But throughout her travels, she had never seen anything quite as bright and beautiful as Nibelung and his little world. So she decided to do something she doesn't usually do and warn him about an oncoming disaster, the Abyss. This wave of destruction was slowly spreading throughout the cosmos and swallowing everything in its path, and it was inevitable that Nibelung and his little planet would one day fall victim to it. Voyager couldn't bear the thought of Nibelung's light going out forever, so she invited him to travel the universe with her and escape the encroaching abyss by running away. But Nibelung refused. In much the same way Voyager couldn't bear to see his light go out, out, Nibelung couldn't bear the thought of leaving his little planet and all the life forms on it behind. Voyager was understandably disappointed in his decision, and before she left to continue her journey alone, she promised to check in on Nibelung at some point in the future should time allow. But Voyager's warning about the oncoming abyss haunted Nibelung. He couldn't abandon his little planet, but he didn't want to watch its light be snuffed out by the abyss either. If Voyager's words were to be trusted, then there was no way to fight the oncoming abyss. So the only remaining option was to take everyone with him and run. And so he tasked his 7 dragon sovereigns, especially the Pyro Sovereign Shwikoatl, with the development of a space program. And to that end, he also decided to craft 3 moons from the Earth, each one governed by its own avatar, a moon goddess. Let's put storytime on pause for a minute because I think it's important to understand the role of the moons and how they were supposed to function, and tangentially, we also need to understand a few things about dragons and the primordial powers of the world, since the moons are technically dragons and they also run on draconic powers. As the primordial entity born alongside the planet, Nibelung could be, and probably should be, considered Teyvat's original god. Neuvillette, one of the dragon sovereigns, even refers to him by such a title. Now, when I say god in this context, I do mean an Abrahamic, or more specifically a biblical god that's capable of creating life and thus performing the miracle of Genesis. As the god of the world, he's represented by the sun or a star, because the symbols are interchangeable, that gives life to the world, and as such, his powers are related to heavenly light. Now, God is served by angels who are born from that holy light, or alternatively the divine fire, depending on your source. And this is what makes angels very different from mortals. They're more like holy ghosts or spiritual entities. Now, within the context of Teyvat, these angels should be dragons. Now, the ranks and roles of angels can change depending on your source as well, but I've found the Neoplatonic philosopher Dionysius's list of ranks to fit Teyvat's model the best. The first category of angels that serve God directly are the seraphim, cherubim, and the thrones. And they're the only 3 I'm really concerned about at the moment. And even then, I'm only really concerned with 2 of those. So if you think of Nibelung as the almighty god, and the moons were created to be the goddesses of all of the dragons, that means the moons rank above everyone except for Nibelung, so they're kind of like second in command. And by this angel ranking, that would make them all seraphim, the spirits of love. Now we can test this hypothesis by looking at Columbina because she's a moon goddess, and it just so happens that she looks an awful lot like a seraphim, right down to the covered eyes and 6 wings, and her chosen constellation is also in the shape of a heart. So I do suspect that the moons were entrusted with Nibelung's love for his world and creations for reasons I'll get to in a minute. Similarly, I suspect the dragon's sovereigns are the thrones or record keepers of the universal laws, since each sovereign is in possession of a divine throne that governs the laws of Teyvat. These thrones would later get passed on to the Archons, who would then govern the universal laws, but we're not really going to talk about that today. Now, the purpose of the moons seems to be twofold. On the one hand, they're meant to sort of serve as the operators and caretakers of the planet of Teyvat. And for the purposes of fulfilling that role, Nibelung gave them fragments of his authorities over the concepts of life, death, space, time, and reason. Now you'll note there are 5 authorities, but only 3 moons, which means that no moon ever had one authority that was dedicated to them. These were authorities that were shared between the moon goddess sisters. The sharing of authorities allowed them to balance power within Teyvat, and also allowed each moon goddess to perform an equal role in protecting Teyvat, probably from the abyss. This is the first and primary purpose of the moons. Now, the second purpose of the moon is a little bit more speculative on my side. It's more implied than it is explicitly stated. Think of this as like a backup role. Like, if Nibelung and the moons were unable to defend Teyvat against the oncoming abyss, then I think the moons were supposed to function as sort of like arks, vessels or spaceships upon which all of the life forms within Teyvat could escape to, so that Nibelung could take them and flee, the way Voyager originally wanted him to. Dragonkind was known for having extremely advanced technology, so I don't believe that thinking of the moons as some sort of like technological marvel or a spaceship with a sentient AI-style goddess operating them is too much of a stretch. Besides, we have Irminsul, which is very computer-like, and it also has an AI goddess avatar in the form of Nahida or Rukkhadevata. We'll talk about her more in a bit. And I also suspect that their humanoid forms were the result of Nibelung creating them in a shape that resembled Voyager, since he longed for the daughter of the stars, which is Voyager in this case. But that's also speculation on my part. Now, small but fairly important side note, while there are only 3 moon goddesses ever mentioned, the Eternal Moon, the Frost Moon, and the Iridescent crescent moon, there are references to a fourth unborn, unnamed moon that Nibelung never lifted into the sky. While some legends claim that its surface became the island of Nod Krai, I do wonder if this unborn moon set within the earth actually ended up in Sumeru instead. Remember that the moons are like arcs, and arcs are more or less seeds of civilization, so it's not unreasonable to imagine a scenario where the fourth moon seed sprouted and became Irminsul. This would make Rukkhadevata and Nahida the fourth moon goddess, which honestly kind of checks out because of their digital avatar nature and the undeniable similarities between Galambina and Nahida's clothing, right down to the little moon decorations. This idea of moon-like arcs being seeds of civilization is very much on brand for Evangelion too, and we all know that Hoyoverse loves Evangelion. You cannot experience any of their games without at least a few references to Evangelion. It's just not possible. But before we move on, I do want to point out that in Finnish mythology, the primeval blacksmith Ilmarinen is the one who forges the world pillar, which is what Irminsul is. The name literally means great pillar, and in Hymns of the Far North, Nibelung is called the primeval blacksmith Iannakoinen, which is another name for Ilmarinen. This suggests that Nibelung either planted or at least created Irminsul, which if true, would solve one really big mystery that's been plaguing us since the very beginning of the game. You know, the who planted Irminsul and when did Irminsul show up argument. But we'll do a deep dive into that another day, I think. Now, in order for the moons to protect their dragon brethren, and as a sign of their authority, Nibelung granted each moon goddess a fragment of his authority and power, which seems to have manifested as a sort of power core that we call a moon marrow. Moon marrow is the source of Kuuvahki, which is Finnish for moon power, but it could also be interpreted as the power of moonlight, since Nibelung could have been likened to a sun whose light is then reflected by the moons. For this reason, Kuuvahki is the most primordial form of power in all of Teyvat, and it seems to be the source of all other non-abyssal powers. In fact, I will argue that Kuuvahki is made up of equal parts phlogiston and primordial seawater, hence why we see the blue, red, and white variations of it all over Nod Krai. We'll come back to the whole magnet thing in a bit too, but I will also argue that all these three primordial powers are technically made of dragon blood, or just are dragon blood. Let me explain. In the finale of Deep Gallery set, Nibelung says, "If the tide of oblivion must come, then let my bones be the bulwark that shields this realm," meaning his bones will protect Teyvat, which is also what the moons were created to do. They were supposed to protect all life on Teyvat. Now later in the set, it says that the bones of the earth were shackled with regards to an incident wherein the moons were supposed to be shackled, once again implying that the moons are the bones of Nibelung. Now bones contain marrow, and moons also contain marrow, apparently, and bone marrow produces blood in the same way that moon marrow produces Kuuvahki. Ergo, Kuuvahki is blood. If you need some more evidence, well, you're in luck because I have some. So modern evolutionary theory posits that all life on Earth originated in the early primordial oceans. Early life forms evolved many types of complex vascular systems in order to circulate this seawater inside of them because they needed it in order to survive, kind of like how we need to breathe air in order to live. And as life began to venture onto dry land, it needed a way to take that seawater with them. Hence, the vascular systems got more and more advanced. Over time, that vascular system full of seawater evolved to do way more things until it became recognizable as the blood we have today. My lore buddy Kat reminded me of this and also sent along a great episode from PBS Eons about it if you're interested. Now, this primordial ocean reminds me a lot of Genshin's primordial sea, because not only does all life within Teyvat come from the primordial sea, but the entire Fontaine Archon quest was about how people with seawater in their veins weren't truly human yet. They were still creatures of the ocean, not truly born for land yet. For this reason, I've come to think of the primordial sea as a representation of the body. After all, the power of water is its ability to take any shape, and primordial seawater seems to have even more potent effects when it comes to reshaping things. We got to see this firsthand in Sigewinne's story quest, where primordial seawater-based cosmetics were used to completely reshape people's appearances. In this context, it's very interesting that Egeria could only use primordial seawater to shape her Oceanid familiars into human forms, but she was unable to transmute that water into true blood and make them into, real human beings. Something that Neuvillette could do because he was supposed to be the heart of the primordial sea. Changing things and reshaping them was kind of his job. So I know that was a long, drawn-out explanation, but I really feel like this is a pretty good explanation of why the primordial sea feels like a representation of the body to me. Phlogiston, on the other hand, is a lot simpler. In Natlan, phlogiston is firmly established as liquid knowledge. You soak in it, you can collect a ton of memories. So I think it's a pretty easy argument to make that phlogiston is a representation of the mind or memories. So red phlogiston plus blue primordial seawater equals white Kuuvahki, a perfect union of body and mind. You might even say that the body and mind fused together forms the self, which is Kuuvahki. As a side note, I do find it very interesting that Irminsul kind of functions like a heart as well, because it is part of a vascular system for Teyvat, right? Like, the ley lines are the veins of the earth. They pump elemental energy and memories, as if they were blood, throughout the entire planet. And if my theory about Irminsul actually being a tree that sprouted from an unborn moon turns out to be right, then essentially Irminsul is pumping a form of Kuuvahki throughout the world, perhaps in the form of both phlogiston and primordial seawater, or slightly altered versions of them for reasons we'll cover in a bit. If so, this could explain why our stamina system in-game is called resin, and the resin has a tree in it, but also comes in moon shapes. The tree is a moon heart that pumps moon blood throughout the world. And the moon blood is Kuuvahki, which also means that Kuuvahki is resin because resin is tree blood. And speaking of Kuuvahki, the concept of Vahki comes from Finnish mythology, and the easiest way to understand it is to simply think of it like spiritual power. The Ku in Kuuvahki means moon, so Kuuvahki literally means spirit power of the moon. But the thing is, in Finnish folklore, there are a ton of types of Vahki, and normal people can obtain the power of Vahki through offerings and rituals to their respective spirits that govern over those types of powers. The two most noteworthy examples that I can find is for Fire Vahki, which can be used by offering blood, and Water Vahki, which can be used by offering up silver. Now, with that context, I will remind you that Lauma, who is from the Frost Moon Scions, worshippers of the Frost Moon, uses her silver blood to heal the bodies of people. Meanwhile, Arlecchino, who descends from the followers of the iridescent moon, has Bale Moon blood fire flowing through her veins that can alter or erase memories. So silver blood can affect the body, fiery blood can affect the mind. The themes are theming here. Now, along these lines, but still as a side note, moon wheels may have been droplets of crystallized moon blood that were formed from moon marrow. Like, on the one hand, we know that they were ritual items given from the moon to their followers in order for their followers to be able to use like a small facsimile of their powers, which is also how they became known as prototype visions. But the reason I'm calling them crystallized blood is because we have an example of something like this happening elsewhere. Back in Inazuma, we saw the Fatui make these artificial visions called delusions out of the crystal marrow that formed from Orobashi's blood. Or at least the crystal marrow is what we call the coagulation of the blood that grows off of Orobashi's bones. That might actually be a better way to put it. But either way, I think this is a really good example of how moon wheels could actually be coagulated bits of moon blood that the moons gave to their followers to grant them power. I really need to do a whole video on like dragon blood lore because like this rabbit hole goes so deep and I'm just not prepared to go through it right now. But as a final note before we go back to story time, a moon marrow also grants a moon goddess the right to open up a passage or a moon gate between Teyvat and their respective moons. I think the initial purpose of this was to be able to shuttle people back and forth from the surface of the planet to the moons when it was time to finally, depart and go on somewhere else, but that remains to be seen. Now, in the Archon quest, the Lindis also says that the moon marrow might even be a sort of portal in and of itself, but I think it might be more accurate to describe the moon marrow as the power core that connects the moon goddess to their moon. Without the marrow, the moon goddess will lack Kuuvahki and authority, as we can see with Columbina, who is not in possession of the marrow that is rightfully hers. Incidentally, this lack of marrow is why she needs the traveler to supply her with Kuuvahki periodically. It's literally like a regular blood transfusion because she cannot produce her own blood, or Kuuvahki. And that's probably why she's so sleepy all the time. And one last thing before we move on. I've had a theory for a long time that visions are basically dragon pearls. And so far, that theory seems to be holding up. Because if you think of visions as dragon pearls, then moon wheels are also dragon pearls, but more like primordial, unrefined versions of them. Because they are basically dragon pearls that the moons gave to their followers. But I do think it's very important to note that the moons themselves are also referred to as wheels many times in the game. Which might suggest that the moons themselves are the visions or moon wheels of someone else, specifically Nibelung. To put it another way, the moons are Nibelung's dragon balls. I'm only mentioning this because it's going to come up in a minute. And okay, I think that's enough explanations for now. Let us get back to story time. After tasking his sovereigns with developing dragon NASA, raising his moon daughters into the sky, and also giving them legions of Kuuvahki to take care of them, Nibelung decided to investigate the abyss that Voyager had warned him was coming and left Teyvat in the moon's care for a while. While we don't know for sure why he decided to do this, it's very possible that the abyss was approaching Teyvat a lot faster than Nibelung expected, and he probably wanted to see what he was up against. I say that because we know that the abyss is currently outside of Teyvat, where the moons currently are. But while he was away, an entity known as Phanes, or the leader of Celestia, or the Heavenly Principles, take your pick, I'm gonna call him Phanes, coerced the moons into some kind of agreement that granted Phanes full authority over them and the planet at large. Phanes then used that authority to not only conquer Teyvat, but also to subjugate all of dragonkind with the help of their 4 shades that they created: Nibarius, Istaroth, Renova, and Asmodee. Small side note, I actually think it's possible that the 4 shades were created using the same technology that creates moon goddess avatars. So like they could have been 3D printed the same way Columbina was. We'll talk about that later. And if so, that would make each of the 4 shades probably something like the cherubim from that angel ranking from earlier. Now, we don't know why Phanes actually wanted to conquer this planet, but we do have this one book called Before Sun and Moon, which talks about this whole time period, and it's just full of references to Noah's Ark. So I actually wonder if Phanes was a leader of a bunch of human refugees, and then they found this planet that looked somewhat habitable and decided that this would be a good place to recolonize and repopulate the human race. Because that's exactly what they set about doing after they won the war. They began terraforming and customizing the world in order to better suit humans instead of dragons. And this meant adjusting the primordial powers of the world, like the primordial sea and phlogiston and Kuuvahki, because they were too harmful to humans. They were toxic almost. Now remember, Kuuvahki is the power of moonlight, essentially, right? So what Phanes seems to have done is split those rays of light into 7 individual colors that we now recognize as the 7 elements of modern Teyvat. Now, I know I've mostly talked about Kuuvahki in terms of it being like a dragon blood power source sort of thing, but it is important to remember that dragons are said to be creatures of the light realm, which means that they are spiritual or light-based beings. So it makes sense if their blood is made of light or has light-like properties. Hence why moonlight blood can be split into different colors that make up elements, right? But thinking about Kuuvahki in terms of light also means we should think about it in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is probably why Nod Krai is full of magnet puzzles. Because, you know, electromagnetism! And that's really all I'm gonna say on that. Now, although Phanes did have absolute authority over the entire planet, that didn't mean that they wiped out all of the hostile entities on the planet. There were still tons of dragons around. So Phanes kind of figured that their newborn human race would need both guidance and protection. So they spun their own race of angels from moonlight, and these angels are what we know of as the seelies. And this slight difference in parentage is the reason why seelies and dragons do not get along. And because Phanes was only able to accomplish all of this because they extracted the vows of obedience from the moons themselves, the dragons considered the moon goddesses to be traitors to the dragon race. So a lot of bad blood between the dragons and the moons and the seelies. We're not off to a good start. Despite the fact that the moon goddesses were the ones who granted Phanes the new authority over Teyvat, the moon goddesses were actually quite displeased with this new master of theirs. But they were also powerless to act against them until Voyager finally returned as promised to see how Nibelung was doing. But Nibelung was nowhere to be found, and some unknown person was seated on his throne. Needless to say, Voyager was very confused, so she decided to investigate the planet for herself. She descended from beyond the sky and indwelled within the body of a young man. Because remember, she's just a spirit. She left her real body somewhere else in space, and she needed a new body in order to traverse this world. So she, in the body of a he, eventually met the first angel that was created by Phanes, an angel by the name of Quatar, aka the Lady Dawn. The two of them fell in love, and then also decided that they wanted to start a revolution together and overthrow the Heavenly Principles, aka Phanes. Easiest way to understand what's going on here is to think of Quatar as Lucifer. Both Lucifer and Quatar are known as the Lightbringers, the Dawnbringers, or the Morning Stars, and both of them led the angels in a war against God in heaven. Anyway, in preparation for the rebellion, Voyager gifted their followers incredible technology, like the Arrow of Tepacuranis. It's a pretty ancient device that's quite similar to the Kuuvahki cannon as far as I can tell. Its job is to take the light-based dragon power and solidify it into a projectile that can obliterate the abyss. This is a pretty important device, but it's not as important as the Voyager's Sampo Mill. The Sampo Mill is a little bit more complicated located in the Arrow of Tippecaranis, mostly because while we know a little bit about what it does, we don't really know what it was for. But what we do know is that it's named after a very important relic from Finnish mythology called the Sampo, which was described as a magic hand mill that can create infinite grain and gold. And much like its mythological counterpart, the Sampo in Genshin is also a divisive creation. In fact, its name is an acronym that stands for Subatomic Assembling Mass Energy Patterning Orb. So once again, it's a synthesizer or transmutation device that can only be operated by someone with the appropriate qualifications and authority. This device is incredibly important to the history of Nod Krai. But I'm bringing it up now because I think there's a very important reason why Voyager made this device in the first place. See, the Sampo has a lot in common with Moon Marrow. Both are these orbs or power cores that can generate incredible amounts of draconic power. And as we'll see later in the video, the Sampo also has the ability to open a doorway or a gateway to another realm, specifically the Abyss realm or perhaps the Moon. I wrote a theory about it. And the Sampo can only be operated by someone who has the appropriate authority. This is what makes it sound exactly like an artificial Moon Marrow. Moon Marrows, again, produce an incredible amount of Kuuvahki or draconic power. They grant a moon goddess authority, and they allow a moon goddess to open a moon gate between the moon and Teyvat. And I think Voyager and Koitar needed this kind of device for reasons we'll get into in a second. Voyager and Koitar also built a giant tower in the golden city of Hyperborea located somewhere in the Northlands. Hyperborea appears to have been a place full of those who worshipped the moon goddesses, especially the frost moon, and thus they had the ability to manipulate Kuuvahki. It made for a very convenient gathering spot for any humans or seelies who wished to overthrow the heavenly principles. So this anti-heaven army would have been made up of seelies and angels, potentially humans, and also the newborn race of the Snowland Fae, which Koitar had spun from the frost moon's light. Now the moons were not completely unaware of what was going on in Teyvat. They knew of the upcoming rebellion, but they could not agree on what to do about it. But they had to make a decision quickly because Nibelung had returned, and he was not pleased with the state he found the planet in. Now, one moon goddess believed that they should side with Nibelung and support him because he was their creator and this planet was technically his. But the other two moon goddesses appeared to have disagreed with the first. One of the dissenting moon goddesses believed that they should remain completely neutral, for it was their role to protect the planet and act in its best interests. And while they may not enjoy working alongside the current heavenly principles, Nibelung had obtained the power of the Abyss, and she was worried about the Abyss's impact on the planet itself. But perhaps their opinion never truly mattered, because Nibelung was furious that they even let this planet fall into the hands of the heavenly principles or Phaenix to begin with. So he punished his moon goddesses by stripping them of their connections to their respective moons and imprisoning them somewhere. If this feels a little bit confusing to you, think of the moons themselves, like the physical structure, as being the bodies of the moons. But then the moon goddesses are like the spirit or soul that inhabits that body. So Nibelung would have split the body and soul, and then imprisoned those souls somewhere else so that they couldn't control their own bodies. Nibelung also stripped them of their authorities and connection to Teyvat, and with nothing left to connect them to their moons or the planet, they were doomed to wither away slowly. Now you remember why I said Koitar and Voyager might have wanted an artificial moon marrow in order to open a moon gate? I think somehow Koitar and Voyager were aware that the moons had been imprisoned somewhere. And this Sampo, or artificial moon marrow device, was a means through which they could access the moons and potentially free them. I'm not sure whether or not they would have believed that the moons were imprisoned by Nibelung or the heavenly principles, but I don't know that it necessarily matters. Either way, this portion is just my speculation. So the heavenly principles at this point is facing two very big problems. On the one hand, they have Koitar and Voyager's rebellion to deal with, and on the other hand, they have the returned Dragon King ready to reclaim his planet with his own army of disgruntled dragons, and the reclaimed power of the three moons which Nibelung had fashioned into weapons. This is why I was calling the moons his Dragon Balls earlier. Think of the moon as like a dragon's flaming pearl. Mythologically speaking, a dragon's flaming pearl is meant to contain a lot of its power and wisdom. So, I kind of feel like the analogy checks out. So everything kind of coalesced into a perfect storm that became known as the Great War of Vengeance. It all began with Koitar and Voyager launching an assault against Heaven, followed by the surviving dragons launching an attack of their own. And it all came to a head when the moons began circling the ocean and Nibelung rose from the depths wielding his full authority and his newfound abyssal power. We don't actually know how the rest of the war played out, but what we do know is that the Heavenly Principles, which is what I've been calling Phanes, now perceived the moons as a threat, which it didn't previously, and so it completely shattered the bodies of the iridescent and eternal moons, which killed their respective goddesses almost instantly. The Frost Moon, on the other hand, appears to have either been accidentally or intentionally thrown beyond the boundaries of the false sky, so its goddess did not die immediately. It's unclear how or if Nibelung was defeated, but he did vanish around the time the war concluded. But it is worth remembering that the Heavenly Principles are not all powerful. They were severely wounded in this war, and many of their functions or authorities had been destroyed or compromised. This Great War of Vengeance appears to have concluded about 6,000 years ago, which for context is about the same age as Zhongli. But even though the war had ended, there was a lot of fallout to deal with. Nibelung's defeat or disappearance led to an influx of abyssal power, flooding the planet and filling it full of abyssal monsters. In an effort to cleanse the land of the abyss, the Heavenly Principles sent down hordes of celestial nails which purified it, and also obliterated a lot of human settlements within the unified civilization, like the Golden City of Hyperborea, the civilization within the chasm, Sol Vindignir, Delphi Pytho, which we know of as Enkanomia, and many other settlements, some of which were buried beneath the earth and became the foundations of the place that we now call Conria. This post-war period was dubbed the Funerary Years, in light of all the death and devastation. What followed was an era where god-kings filled massive power vacuums throughout the mortal realm, while Phanes was preoccupied cleaning up all of the abyssal contamination, and also allegedly punishing everyone responsible for the war in the process. As a result of Phanes' work, all but 5 seelies were stripped of their forms, reduced to nothing but tiny spirits that hungered for lost memories. These 5 seelie survivors either were spared from, managed to escape from, or were immune to Phanes' punishment, and I think I might know why. Do note that this theory may not actually hold up in practice, because obviously we have other seelie survivors like Nicole, but I'm mentioning it anyway because I do think that there are some themes that are worth considering, perhaps not in this application, but in other applications. See, prior to the start of the war, Koitar had addressed 4 seelies specifically and issued each of them a prophecy. Nabu Malikata was destined to meet her end in the Sumeru Desert. Sibylla would meet hers in the depths of the Remurian Sea. Yohal Tekutin would survive alone in the realm of the dead, in Natlan, and the Celadon Mare, whose real name is unknown, would wait for something that may never arrive in Liyue. Now that you know who they are, let me explain my hypothesis on why they survived. See, Koitar explicitly instructed these 4 angels to drench their wings in filth before the war. Now, generally, Genshin uses filth to refer to the abyss, and if that's also the case here, then Koitar and her 4 companions may have tried to use forbidden knowledge from the abyss to fight Phanes, which is also what Apep thinks Nibelung tried to do. So in other words, these 4 angels drenched themselves in the abyssal muck, and that's what prevented them from dying. Now, like the 4 named seelies, Voyager and Koitar also allegedly survived, but were punished separately from the rest of them. It's said that their memories were forcibly wiped and that the 2 were forbidden from ever seeing each other again. We don't know what happened to them after that, except that at some point, Koitar was able to pass on some of her remaining power to Boreas, aka Andreas. Yeah, the wolf in Mondstadt. As for the fate of the moons and their goddesses, well, the iridescent and eternal moons had been completely destroyed and shattered by the abyssal dragon. The heart of the eternal moon landed in Nod Krai, while the iridescent moon's marrow sank into the sea and reappeared in Conria, where it was renamed the Crimson Moon. Only the Frost Moon survived long enough to bear witness to the post-war devastation, but she knew that her time was limited. So in her final hours, she instructed the survivors of Hyperborea, which had been destroyed by a celestial nail during the war, to travel south to Nod Krai and settle on Hisi Island. She also granted them one final blessing before she withered away. These Hyperborean refugees of the Frost Moon would eventually become known as the Frost Moon Scions. And that concludes our known timeline, but I do think it's important to remember that it is in this post-war period that the 3rd Descender, Saralainen, or Ajax if you prefer, met the Tsaritsa and ended up opening a forbidden gateway at the request of the Tsaritsa's father, the Belyit Tsar. Saralainen was either torn to pieces by the gateway itself, something I wrote a whole theory about, or they were split into pieces by Phanes as punishment for opening the gateway. We're not really sure which it is. But regardless, those 7 fragments were fashioned into the 7 Gnosis, and were offered up as as prizes to the 7 victors of the Archon War, which followed soon after. The Archon War didn't really reach Nod Krai, so I won't mention much more about it. I just wanted to mention it as context for the greater world timeline. And I also wanted to mention it because Phaenix is, as far as we know, the first Descender, which should make Voyager the second Descender, although that is not explicitly confirmed anywhere. I think that also helps solidify the timeline because then we can look at the Traveler, who is the 4th Descender and also the last one to arrive in Teyvat, and go, yeah, okay, this order of arrival makes sense. And just to put all that in perspective, the first Descender, the Heavenly Principles, should have arrived in Teyvat well over 6,000 years ago, while the second Descender, allegedly Voyager, should have arrived around 6,000 years ago, before the start of the Funerary years. Now, because he was split into the 7 Gnosis, the third Descender, Saralainen, must have arrived in Teyvat anywhere from 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, give or take. That wide estimate is because he has to have arrived after the Funerary years, because he rediscovered the ruins of Hyperborea, which was destroyed during those wars. But also he must have arrived before the Archon War, since his remnants were issued as prizes for said war. And the earliest known date that we have for the Archon War is about 3,700 years ago. And that leaves us with the 4th Descender, the Traveler, who we know, or we think, arrived in Teyvat around 500 years ago, a few years prior to the Conrian Cataclysm. Now, as much as I'd like to spend more time elaborating on the events of the Archon War and the Conrian Cataclysm, those events are kind of crucial parts of each nation's history rather than Teyvat's collective history. And I kind of have this little tradition of compiling each nation's history near the end of each patch cycle, so I think this is a good place to end our little history lesson for today. Now, my lovely little channel members have been scrolling on by for a while now, and they deserve a thank you for putting up with my nonsense. And so do you, because you watch my nonsense. So thank you! And also, thanks to Arknights Endfield for sponsoring this video, and don't forget to pre-register for that. And also pre-register for my video! Well, I guess you can't really pre-register for a video. Oh well, hopefully I'll just see you there anyway. Take care of yourselves until then, and ta-ta for now.